point in your life that you are now, that your enemies, maybe they had video footage, I don't know, but they did a thorough investigation of your life and they knew every minute detail, every deep, dark secret. If they were to do that type of investigation, what would they find about your life? If your life were exposed to that type of scrutiny, would it stand up? You know, that hypothetical situation is very similar to what we see in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel's enemies were seeking to find some sort of hole in his character, but they were unable to do so. If you have your Bibles, turn to Daniel chapter 6. Beginning in verse 1, it reads, "It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, 'We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God.' Every effort to expose a flaw in Daniel's character or reputation came up empty. These men searched and searched, but they could find no holes in his character. Through all of Daniel's living in the king's court, he had remained faithful. Now remember that Daniel at this point is an old man. He came to Babylon as a young man. Now he is older. He is now serving under King Darius, who is the ruler of a new nation, Medo-Persia. And while some things have changed, one thing remains a constant, and that is, once again, we're going to see Daniel's faith put to the test. But first, we see that Daniel had the right kind of enemies. Daniel had the kind of enemies that were jealous because of his righteousness. He had the kind of enemies that searched his life trying to find some sort of flaw, but were unable to do so. And so therefore they had to come up with a different plan. And so they go and they stroke the king's ego, if you will. Let's continue reading in verse 6. It says, "Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. 'King Darius live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish this injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked.' Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is, the injunction." I mean, who doesn't like having their ego stroked a little bit, right? Certainly the king did. He fell into the trap of the satraps, the commissioners, the prefects, and he signs this document. And as soon as he signs the document, Daniel had to have known that his fate was sealed, right? Because there will always be a time when our faith comes in conflict with the world, but for Daniel it was a no-brainer. He would not bow down to another god. He would not serve anyone but the one true God. You know, I was watching a basketball game not long ago, and before the game, the reporter asked the coach, she said, "What are you going to do tonight to handle the pressure that the other team is going to throw at you?" And the coach said, "We're not going to do anything different. We're going to keep being who we've always been because that's what got us to this point. If we play our game, then we're going to be fine." And I think if Daniel were to be interviewed before this episode, I think he'd say the same thing. "Daniel, what are you going to do when faced with the lion's den?" "I'm going to keep being who I've always been. I'm going to keep doing what I've always done because that's who I am. I'm not going to change a thing. If I do what I'm supposed to do, then everything's going to be fine." Daniel teaches us a very important lesson when it comes to being faithful to the one true God, and that is you must keep being who you've always been. When faced with the stark reality of the lion's den, Daniel did not bend. Notice verses 10 through 13. It says, "Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house, Now, in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making the petition 3 times a day. Daniel kept being who he had always been. Nothing was going to change that, not even facing the lion's den. The king's edict didn't change a thing for Daniel. And Scripture states that once the document was signed, the first thing Daniel did was hit his knees. Now, apparently, Daniel didn't try to hide his faith. He didn't try to hide his actions. His windows had always been open. They stayed open. These commissioners, these prefects, these satraps, they didn't have any problem finding Daniel in prayer, prostrate before his God. It didn't take them long to find him breaking the king's edict because Daniel had always been faithful and nothing was going to change that. When they called for the lions, Daniel kept being who he had always been. You know, if you're going to run a marathon, you don't begin training the day before. If you're going to play baseball for the first time ever, you don't learn how to throw or hit the day of the game. And it's the same way with faith. At some point, you will face the lion's den in some shape or form. You don't wait until that moment to start living faithfully. And you don't wait until the day your life gets investigated, like Daniel's did, to start living faithfully. We should be working diligently each and every day to live Christ-like so that when the pressure does come, we don't change a thing. We just keep being who we've always been. There are many who find themselves compromising their faith when faced with the lions. Many people find themselves compromising their faith when the lions start to growl because their faith hasn't been strong enough up to that point. We keep being who we've always been because we started at a very early age, or we started at a time in our lives where we became faithful and we remained faithful all the way up to that point in the small things so that when the big things come, we're able to face them as well with courage and conviction. Daniel could have closed his windows. He could have prayed in solitude so that no one would see him. He could have been very covert about his actions, but he didn't hide it. Daniel could have said, well, the injunction only lasts for 30 days, so for that 30 days, I'll just lay low. I'll continue to pray, but I'll bow to the king in public. But Daniel doesn't do that. Daniel keeps being who he always had been. His life was marked by prayer. His life was marked by faith, and that was not going to change no matter what edict the king signed or no matter what injunction he enforced. Some have concluded that Daniel's real lion's den was in his room that day. That when he hit his knees, he assured himself the victory. The battle was over at that point. Being tossed in the lion's den wouldn't matter. Whether God shut their mouths or whether he was devoured, the battle was won prostrate, humbly before his God. Verse 10 is a key verse. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had windows open towards Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God. And notice it says, as he had been doing previously. As he had been doing all along, he didn't change a thing. The circumstances didn't change Daniel's approach. Daniel kept being who he had always been, and he kept doing what he had always done before. Unfortunately, so many folks find it easy to pray or show devotion to God when things are comfortable or convenient, but yet they abandon their faith when things become difficult. Sadly, many people turn their backs on God when faced with the lion's den, or they blame God for the different trials or tribulations that they're going through. Those moments should draw us as close to God as ever, but many turn their backs on him in that moment. Daniel's faith wasn't tied to how life was playing out for him in the moment. Daniel was a steady, consistent, constant Christian or child of God, however you want to put it, through this whole time. He was someone who stayed faithful, even in the face of roaring lions. I want you to think about all the lions in your den, all the lions that you have faced in your life. How did you overcome them? Maybe they defeated you. Maybe you learned a lesson there. Maybe you were devoured and you had to pick yourself back up. Many of us face difficult trials and tribulations in life, and if we haven't, we're going to at some point. How do we face those without God on our side? How do we enter into the lion's den without faith? It's very difficult. It's impossible to come out better on the other side if God is not with us. Do we perceive a relationship with God as something worth dying for? Is our faith constant and consistent like Daniel's was? Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said, when Christ calls a man, he bids him to come and die. Do we have a faith worth dying for? Hopefully we do. You think about the lions that are in your den right now. The last thing that we should ever do is find ourselves turning our backs on God, but rather we should find ourselves on our knees, because we are never more powerful than we are when we are humbly prostrate before our God in prayer. If we want to keep from being the lion's lunch, then we must begin building a deep, rock-solid faith right here and right now, so that we don't waver when the lions growl. Now, the true story is told about a couple who retired and decided to buy a top-of-the-line RV. And they headed on vacation towards the West Coast. And this elderly couple, the gentleman was driving. He decided it was time for a nap, so he asked his wife if she would come and drive for a while. And she said certainly. So she came, assumed the driver's seat. She got behind the wheel, and she set the cruise control and headed down the road. But at one point, she decided that she needed to go to the bathroom, so she simply got up and went to the bathroom. She assumed that cruise control was the same thing as automatic pilot. Well, long story short, the RV crashed, it was totaled, they were okay. But she learned the lesson that cruise control and automatic pilot are not the same thing, right? Many times we set our faith on cruise control. We set the speed that we want, the level of commitment that we want, and we just head down the road. And we don't think much of it until a roadblock comes, till a curve comes, or a steep hill or a deep valley, and then all of a sudden we're shaken. Because all this time we had just set it on cruise control. We had never really given much thought to our faith. And then when those deep valleys hit, when those roadblocks or those hindrances come, we don't really know how to react. We can't set our faith on cruise control. We can't just assume that faith is like automatic pilot, that we can just set it and forget it, that we can walk away and everything's going to be fine. Daniel certainly didn't do that. He kept being who he had always been, and he kept doing what he had always done before. Let's keep reading in verses 16 through 24. It says, Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said, Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king arose at dawn, at the break of day, and went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near to the den, to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, that they may not harm me, inasmuch as I have been found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king. I have committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all of their bones. Isn't it something that the lions would have starved to death had Daniel not been rescued? You know, the character of Daniel is something that we have exploited throughout this entire series. And I want you to take note of his profound trust in God. We have the benefit of reading this story to the end and knowing the outcome, but Daniel didn't. Did Daniel know that God would shut the mouths of those lions? No, not necessarily. But he was willing to go to the lion's den regardless of what the outcome would be. No matter what happened, he knew that victory was assured. Because of what he had always been before, what he was doing now, he kept being who he had always been. He kept doing what he had always done, and he kept trusting whom he had always trusted. His faith was in the one true God. And therefore, whether the lions' mouths were closed or whether they devoured him like a piece of raw meat, it didn't matter. His victory was assured. You and I both know that God doesn't always close the mouths of the lions. We see in the first century many men and women who were Christians who were devoured by lions, literally, because of their faith. God doesn't always close the mouths of the lions, but He always promises not to leave us nor forsake us, even when we're in the lion's den. Therefore, if we remain constant in our faith, keep being who we've always been, keep doing what we've always done, and keep trusting whom we've always trusted, we are assured the victory. We can overcome. We must trust Him in the lighter moments so that when those difficult moments come, we're able to stand firm when the lions are growling. God chose to close the mouths of the lions, therefore saving the life of Daniel. But you know, it's interesting to note a few things. First of all, I want you to notice that God allowed Daniel to go into the lion's den. You know, Daniel could have sent some lightning bolt to strike all his enemies dead right there on the spot, but he didn't. He allowed them to prevail for the moment. He allowed Daniel to enter into that lion's den, not knowing what his outcome would be. Secondly, we notice that God shut the mouths of the lions, but as we said a moment ago, He doesn't always. Sometimes we are devoured. Sometimes we feel like we're being eaten alive by the trials and tribulations that come. And sometimes those trials may take our physical life. But victory is still assured. And finally, Daniel teaches us that doing the right thing can come with a price. You know, we have this idea that in the world, truth always wins. In the spiritual realm, that's true, but in the world, not necessarily. Many times you will be persecuted for speaking the truth and believing the truth. You look in our culture today, religion has a very bad name. Christianity has a bad name among the world around us. We are not elevated to honorable status by the world. In fact, we are persecuted, we are mocked, we are ridiculed many times. Truth always wins from a spiritual perspective, but in the world it can bring consequences. Like Daniel, we must always remember the real issue. We must always remember who we serve. In Jeremiah 12:5, I want you to notice these words. He says, if you have run with the footmen and they have tired you out, then how can you compete with horses? If you fall down in a land of peace, how will you do in the thicket of the Jordan? We compete with the horses by running with the footmen. We're able to run with the horses because in the lighter moments of life, we have been doing what we should have been doing all along. We have been steady and constant in our faith, consistent in our faith, so that when we have to run faster, so that when those trials come, we are able to keep up. How can you run with the horses if you can't keep up with the footmen? We face lions with courage by being faithful in the times of peace, so that when the lions come, we just keep being who we've always been. We keep doing what we've always done, and we keep trusting whom we've always trusted. We notice that in this series we've been studying on Daniel, that consistency was a major attribute to his life, to his character. Daniel was consistent in his faith. The problem with so many of us is that we run hot and cold. We're off and on, we're up and down, we tire out too quickly and we can't keep up. So when the lions come, we get devoured. I want to encourage you this morning not to be the lion's lunch. I want to encourage you this morning to start developing the type of faith that will stand firm in the face of the lions. That when they start growling, you're able to be convicted and strong, knowing that you're prepared no matter what the outcome. Several years ago, a newspaper in Nashville published the story of Leila Craig. And at the time the story was published, Leila Craig was 80 years old. And she had not missed church services in 1,040 Sundays. And in the article, the author asked the question, what is wrong with Leila Craig? How could she not have missed church on Sunday for so many Sundays in a row? Didn't she ever get home late on Saturday night and not feel like getting up on Sunday morning to go to church? Hadn't she ever had a week where she was very stressed and needed that extra Saturday, and so she didn't go to church on Sunday? Hasn't she ever just decided to stay home and to catch up on chores, maybe listen to a sermon on the radio, but not come through the doors of the church building? And again, it asks the question, what's wrong with Mrs. Craig? Well, we know there's nothing wrong with her, right? She just kept being who she'd always been, kept doing what she had always done, and kept trusting in whom she'd always trusted. I pray that our lives are marked with such consistency, that we are the kind of people who can stand firm in the lighter moments and certainly in the trials, that when faced with the lion's den, we can keep being who we've always been, keep doing what we've always done, and keep trusting in whom we've always trusted. Perhaps you're sitting here this morning and maybe your life is not marked with consistency. Maybe you're one of those that we described as on again, off again, up and down. Maybe you run hot and cold. Maybe you're someone who has set your faith on cruise control and you have forgotten it. Maybe you need to get back on track. Let us help you this morning. Maybe you're not a child of God. Maybe you've not even started the journey. Let me ask you this morning, if you keep being who you've always been, what will be the outcome? If you keep doing what you've always done, what will be the result? Who are you trusting in this morning? If it's not God, I can tell you the answer to those first two questions. If you're not prepared, if you've not accepted Christ through faith, through repentance, through confessing Him, and being immersed in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins, I encourage you to do that this morning. Whatever your need is, come now as we stand and as we sing.